So our third snippet this week is going to look at the sort of increasingly controversial Supreme Court confirmation process under Reagan. So remember, Reagan in his first term only gets one Supreme Court nomination, and that's Sandra Day O'Connor, a conservative but not an ultra conservative, and O'Connor was also. O'Connor's approach, and part of this, I think, was due to her background as a former fairly powerful state legislator in Arizona. O'Connor tended to prefer to make decisions as narrowly as possible on the basis of the question before the court, rather than issue these broad decisions that would transform U.S. constitutional law. So there are very, very few O'Connor decisions on the court that that make any difference in the long term. So she's not a revolutionary justice in this respect, even though she's a revolutionary justice, in another respect, in that she's the first woman who ever serves on the Supreme Court. But Reagan, in his second term, wants to go more conservative. He wants, sort of more conservative activist thinkers. 1986, Chief Justice Burger announces his intention to step down. Reagan proposes elevating William Rehnquist, the most conservative member of the court, a Nixon nominee, to be Chief Justice, and replacing Rehnquist with Antonin Scalia, a federal court judge, who would be the first Italian-American ever to serve on the court, a brilliant man who was seen as very, very conservative. Democrats, who are not a majority in the Senate at this point, really don't have much of a chance of blocking this. They spend most of their time attacking Rehnquist, and Scalia is ultimately confirmed unanimously. This is Reagan with Scalia, and Scalia will help shift the court substantially to the right, in large part because his opinions are constantly sort of engaging in kind of big ideas. He's a very he's an activist judge in many respects. In the 1986 midterm elections, the Republicans lose control of the Senate. This turns out to be very, very significant. And the result is that when Reagan gets his next nomination to the Supreme Court in 1987, when Justice Lewis Powell, Nixon, a nominee who was sort of a moderate conservative, Powell steps down, Reagan chooses a very conservative law professor and federal judge named Robert Bork. This is a name that you might remember. Bork was the Justice Department official who eventually agreed with Richard Nixon's demand to fire Special Prosecutor Cox in the Watergate scandal. In retrospect, Reagan should have nominated Bork in 1986 and then Scalia in 1987, but the administration didn't anticipate losing control of the Senate. So Bork is facing a much more hostile Senate than Scalia was. And Bork has another problem which Scalia did not, although Scalia's judicial opinions were, they were sharply conservative. They engaged with ideas. Scalia was a brilliant writer. Scalia didn't have a ton of a paper trail outside of the federal judiciary. Bork had been a law professor and had frequently written law reviews, and his record reveals a very, very conservative approach to the law. Some of his legal writings were skeptical of how far the Civil Rights Act should go in safeguarding its racial discrimination. He was a critic of the right to privacy. He clearly was not terribly sympathetic to women's rights, at least through the court system. And in the Senate confirmation process, Bork is strongly attacked by Senate Democrats. And this excerpt, this is from Ted Kennedy, the liberal Democratic senator from Massachusetts, who basically outlines the Democratic case against Bork.
In Robert Bork's America, there is no room at the inn for blacks and no place in the Constitution for women. And in our America, there should be no seat on the Supreme Court for Robert Bork. Mr. Bork has been equally extreme in his opposition to the right to privacy. In an article in 1971, he said, in effect, that a husband and wife have no greater right to privacy under the Constitution than a smokestack has to pollute the air. What I hear you're saying here now is that the test that was used about 90 years ago, and which was the basis for discrimination against women, is the standard that you would use. You may be able to elaborate on it, but that's at least what I'm hearing.
Well, I don't know if it was the basis for discrimination against women. I think that society saw all kinds of distinctions, legal distinctions between men and women as entirely reasonable and rational. This society no longer sees them that way, and that is fine.
Bork is not a good witness. I mean, and part of the problem is, again, he has this long record. I mean, a lot of Kennedy's attacks are hyperbolic and in some ways unfair, but Bork is not really a strong argument for himself. And if you're a neutral person watching this testimony, you don't get the sense that this is a prospective justice who's going to be particularly concerned with using his position to promote equality. And the result is, for the first time since the Nixon administration, there is a rejection of a Supreme Court nominee. And here the rejection is overwhelming, 58 to 42 no. The green marks on this chart, Senator Boren and Senator Hollings, are the two Democrats who vote in favor of Bork's confirmation. What's striking here on the chart is all of the red marks on the chart. These are Republicans who vote against Bork because they see him as too right-wing. John Chafee, who was from Rhode Island, Bob Packwood from Oregon, Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania, Robert Stafford from Vermont, John Warner, somewhat surprising vote, from Virginia, and Lowell Weicker from Connecticut. Apart from Warner, who was pretty conservative, the other five are moderate or even liberal Republican senators. Weicker was more liberal than many Democrats were in the 1980s. And the message from the Senate here to Reagan is, look, we are not going to look kindly on the idea of a strongly conservative nominee. So Reagan goes back to his advisors. We're now moving later into 1987. Says, get me a nominee who's conservative, but who doesn't have the paper trail of Bork. They ultimately choose Douglas Ginsburg, a youngish federal judge. But it turns out that Ginsburg had smoked marijuana when he was in college, and I think as a law professor too, in a sane world, this is not disqualifying to be on the Supreme Court. But the First Lady, Nancy Reagan, had pushed this anti-drug policy of just say no, and the sense was, you can't have a Supreme Court justice who has used an illegal drug. And so Ginsburg is forced to withdraw. And ultimately, very late in the game in 1988, it's not clear, he's not going to get another chance. Reagan goes to his advisors and says, look, I need a conservative nominee, but someone who can get through the Senate. And ultimately, they choose a nominee from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is on the Pacific coast, named Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy is, he's a California justice. His family was connected in California politics. He knew Reagan from that time. He also knew Reagan's Attorney General, Edwin Meese. He had a reputation which was deserved as a reliably pro-business conservative. But as we'll see, Kennedy also had some iconoclastic views, especially on sexual orientation. And he's someone who never would have gotten nominated but for the difficulties of Bork and Ginsburg. So when we think of these in some ways accidents of history, Kennedy, who authors every major opinion on gay rights until the very recent Bostock case from the past Supreme Court term, gets the nomination in large part because Reagan, screwed up in terms of the selection between Bork and Scalia when Republicans had controlled the Senate, and then because Bork is such a terrible nominee in terms of his public image in 1987. But Kennedy will be overwhelmingly confirmed and will stay on to the court for the next 30 years. So Reagan ultimately gets 3 Supreme Court nominations, but 2 of them, Kennedy and O'Connor, are relatively moderate centrist conservatives. It's only Scalia, who's a very, very conservative figure, and obviously the elevation of Rehnquist to be Chief Justice, but Rehnquist was already on the court. And that's it for our third snippet.